You've got a minute. This meeting is now being live streamed.
Okay. All right.
So many stages.
I know.
And now whenever you're ready, it's all yours.
Okay. Okay, whenever we're ready. Well, it's always interesting saying hi to a room of people who you can't see and are all at home and are staring at you.
Yeah.
But I mean, hi everybody. It's lovely to not be able to see you, but to feel you somehow. Thank you so much for joining us with the Lighthouse Bookshop and with Alyssa Songsiridej to talk about a book that really hasn't left my mind since I put it down. Alyssa, how are you? Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm good. I'm really excited to be chatting with the United Kingdom. Great.
Yes, all of the United Kingdom. I mean, this is being recorded, so
yeah.
The people who are here today, who knows, the rest of the UK and Scotland might be tuning in later. I mean, I'm really, really excited to get into Little Rabbit, which has some of the most incredible quotes about it, like the one from Carmen Maria Machado, who's called it a deeply empathetic and horny novel. I mean, Alyssa, why do you think she's chosen those words to describe your book?
Empathetic and horny?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's actually kind of like the perfect encapsulation of what I was sort of trying to do with the book, which is that I was really trying to embed the reader into the consciousness of a woman who was very, very horny, or who was like, just really lusting after like a guy. I think I've said this before in like sort of US events and things, but like something that I noticed as I was, kind of coming up as a writer and like reading as much as I could, was that I was reading a lot of books where there is like the woman would be like the lust object, like she would be being pursued, and that would be kind of the driving narrative force of the book. But I didn't like read that many books where women were the lustful agent, like they were the one going forward and like pursuing something, or if they were punished in some way, or it was like it came at a cost and in a way that like men just were not depicted as being punished. And so I wanted to like kind of do a corrective to that, or to like kind of portray what I have experienced, which is sometimes you're just lusting after someone.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned when you were coming up as a writer, and I just want to make sure that everybody who is in the virtual room with us today understands how brilliant you are. So Alyssa Songsiridej is an editor at Electric Literature. Her fiction has appeared in Story Quarterly, the Indiana Review, the Offing, and Columbia, a Journal of Literature and Art. Alyssa has also been supported by Yaddo, the UCross Foundation, the Ragdale Foundation, and the Vermont Studio Center, amongst many others. Little Rabbit is her first novel. It's she's National Book Foundation 5 under 35, tongue twister, honoree, and she lives in Philadelphia. So I think maybe, Alyssa, it would be really nice to set things off with you just telling us a bit more about where that empathy and horniness comes from. Who are these characters that we're meeting in the book? What is this? Who is the person who is sort of the object of lust, or the giver of lust and receiver, that we're meeting in Little Rabbit?
Right. So the main, lustful agent in Little Rabbit is this woman who's unnamed throughout most of the book on purpose, and she's like just turned 30. She's kind of, in this stage where you're not really young anymore. You're not like, you're not like a buzzing new 20-something-year-old, but you're not quite like, you haven't quite figured out who you want to be as an adult, or at least that's how I felt as I was 30. Maybe other people figured it out faster than I did. But, I think it's like a very interesting in-between stage where you're kind of figuring out what you want to do with the next stage of your life. And she lives in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is like kind of part of the greater Boston area. She's been there since she graduated from college, except for like going to a grad program, and she lives with her best friend, Annie. And she's queer, she's bisexual, but she's primarily sort of had relationships with women, or as she calls them, like beta men, like just sort of and she's a writer also. And what sort of happens is that before the events of the novel, she has like gone to a residency, and she's met this older man who's the choreographer. That's what he's known for through most of the novel. And at the residency, she does not like him because she finds he talks too much at dinner, and he's like super annoying and like, why are you taking up so much space, dude? But then the book opens with him inviting her to go see a performance of his dance company in Boston months after they've been at the residency, and like something has kind of shifted, and suddenly she's like interested in him. She's like kind of decides to pursue him, and that relationship sort of takes her on a journey she doesn't really expect.
And I mean, I would love to sort of start things off by getting into that decision to not name these two characters, because you mentioned Annie and some of the other characters, family members and friends, they're all named. And did it help you explore something in the characters to use nicknames and to not name them? Or what was the sort of, did it help you explore something that maybe would have been harder if you'd named them?
Yeah, absolutely. So like my thought process as I was going through drafting was, like one of the main tensions of the book is between how we're perceived by other people, like our kind of public facing self, and how we're sort of experiencing a moment like internally. And I'm really interested in that distance between like what someone thinks of you but how you feel it, because you can have two people in the same room, but they're perceiving it differently. They're perceiving you differently than the way you're feeling. And I especially wanted to focus on the internal like mechanics of a relationship, the relationship between the narrator and the choreographer. And so the names, like, Little Rabbit is his nickname for her. She thinks of him as the choreographer. And so the names that they're going by in the book for much of it are kind of their private names for each other. So it's this like internal thing that they're kind of working out. And I didn't want to sort of bring their public selves into the narrative until later on, until something had kind of been worked out or settled in between them, if that makes sense. So what you're doing, what the narrative is trying to do is it's trying to like bring you into kind of this internal world that is not necessarily seen by someone who would know her by like her real name, professional name, or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Maybe just to get a sense of that, would you be happy to read a little bit from the book for us?
Yeah, sure. I'll read a little bit of chapter 2. So this scene takes place in New York, which is where the choreographer lives. So she lives in Boston, but he lives in New York City. So that's kind of like a long distance situation. And nothing has happened yet, but he's invited her down to come witness a rehearsal. Or actually, she's invited herself down to go witness a rehearsal. She's like jerry-rigged this like fake profile of his company because she just was struck by how hot he was the last time she saw him. So I'll just read a little bit. And she's showing up at his rehearsal space. The cool walls of the old brownstone building mixed with the heat, so the air turned strange and clammy. Walking through the long halls of identical doors, I felt like a child again, suddenly oversized, wandering until I found the sounds of music and counting. I could hear his voice, the sound of his hands clapping. Wiping my sweaty palms on my shorts, I grabbed the door handle and pulled. The rehearsal space still felt like a classroom, the walls a different color where the chalkboards had been. Cool air battled through new aluminum vents. 6 or 7 glorious bodies moved through the middle of the room, cutting around each other, stopping, stretching, lifting and throwing one dancer to another. Even though I never seen anyone else do the things they did, their bending, twisting feet made them seem more human, like they'd found new doors into how to be a body. The choreographer stood in front of them all, watching them, instructing. He wore a white t-shirt and soft black pants, his arms wrapped around his torso as he focused. I could see the line of his waist, the lean muscles that still bound him. More point with the chin, he called. You should be leading with the sternum. Carry the motion through. I closed the door silently behind me, but he still noticed and walked over. Could you take off your shoes, he asked, looking at my dirty white sneakers. A soft matte material covered the oddly springy floor. Sorry, I said, towing them off. They changed as soon as you walked in the door, he said, looking at the dancers, just a millimeter tighter. I'm sorry, I repeated. No, it's the permanent problem of a performer, he said. It's just too bad you'll never see how they move when we're alone. He went back to his spot, watching the dancers and shouting out commands, suggestions so specific I couldn't follow. The song ended, the performers hitting their last pose. Good work, he said, clapping. Now let's get Jackie, TJ, and Zach for the trio. Jackie was the dancer with the long brown hair. Today, she'd wrapped it up in a tight ballerina bun and dressed her body in a white leotard made of tissue-thin fabric. I stared at the muscles winging across her back, her thighs, until I felt absurd, goggle-eyed. She turned away from my gaze, her forearms up against the back of her head with her mouth pressed into her bicep. Her right leg was up, and the two male dancers crowded the floor around her, one taking her raised calf in his palm. They held still for a beat, turned into living Grecian statues. Then the music began and they sprang to life, one male dancer lifting Jackie, their backs to each other, then tossing her to the other who caught her by the waist. She seemed trapped for a moment with her legs stiff behind her, before swirling free, the world turned by her hips. Stop, the choreographer called. Jackie, you need to be initiating the movement more from the pelvic bowl. He crossed the room to stand next to her, pointing his thumbs at his own hips. Imagine you have two strings tugging your iliac crests. He swiveled to demonstrate, shifting the balance of his knees. Jackie copied him. I reached into my leather satchel for water, but I didn't have any. I felt a pen. Oh, notes, I remembered. I should be taking notes. And when you hit the right elbow, hit it. She struck a pose with her right elbow up and out. You need to point a little higher. He touched her elbow with two fingers, adjusting. And look a little more this way. The fingers went to her cheek, guiding her face. So you're looking stage left, right there, right at her. They locked at me, the choreographer pointing. Jackie smiled and I gave a small, stupid wave. And we'll stop there.
It was a beautiful reading. Thanks so much, Alyssa. I mean, just even hearing that description of dance again, dance being one of the horniest sports out there. I mean, it is undoubtedly like an erotic thing. And so it feels silly to ask you why you chose dance, but I guess I'm wondering what led you to a focus on dance for this novel.
I just found I find dance to be like endlessly fascinating and also as far from like what I do, I think, as like kind of humanly possible, or as like as far from like, if you think about all the different kind of art modes, like being kind of a hermit in your house, disembodied from yourself and like typing on a computer versus being like this incredible body moving through space, making like art with your corporeal form that can like really only be fully experienced by like sitting in a room with that person, with that body actively doing the thing. It's just like so different and so kind of far from what I do. And of course, I was like, oh, it's so far from what I do. So I want to try to bring what I do and try to get as close to it as like possible, like to try to capture that kind of feeling of being in a room with a dancer and seeing them just do stuff that is like sort of unimaginable to me, and that is like conveying a feeling that is unimaginable to me. Because I think it's amazing. It's incredible.
So did you watch quite a lot of dance when you were writing this and researching and preparing for it?
Well, so I drafted the novel during early lockdown, so like in March of 2020. So I couldn't physically go anywhere or see anything at that time. But what happened was like right before COVID, and I think this kind of affected my mental state and what I was thinking about and focusing on as I was working. I like went to a residency and there was like a dance company in residence there, and like there was a choreographer kind of working with his dancers, like, and we did demonstrations for each other, so we got to see him sort of working and like building movement on the dancers and like building these artworks on their specific bodies. And I was just like completely fascinated and thinking about it as, you know, the world sort of shut down for a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed all of the sort of the very like bodily descriptions of dance. And I think something that's really interesting about this book is the overall focus on power, but you kind of do that. You look at a few different things. Like, to me, it seems like you're looking at a few different things that have power or show power, and the physicality of dance is one of those things. And I guess just power in general, is that something that particularly interests you in terms of, like, I guess, romantic dynamics, but also sort of structural powers? You mentioned briefly the idea that the fact that that the character of Rabbit is bisexual, living with a flatmate who's a lesbian, and sort of thinking about these sort of power dynamics in terms of our society. Yeah, I mean, was that something that you enjoyed sort of exploring, or did you have different ideas of how you wanted to approach power, but it kind of went down a different route?
I feel like I think about power like sort of all the time and a lot. I don't know if it's because I'm American or what. But definitely like all the different kind of realms of power that you sort of identified were things that were sort of going through my head as I was working. Like on the one hand, there's like the kink aspect of the book, which I think, you know, when you look at sort of so spoiler alert, they kind of go into like a sort of sub-dom relationship, which when you sort of look at the outside of a sub-dom relationship, it looks, and this is the perception versus like the internal experience thing. On the outside, it looks like it can be, you know, only one person has the power and the other person is submitting, but that actually there's like an interplay of like, you know, to submit, to give up power means you have it in the first place, which can be like a very empowering act, versus, you know, moving in a relationship where it is not assumed that you have power, or where your power is not like taken as like as being innately there. So that was sort of one aspect that I was playing with. And then the other aspect kind of is in their outside life, you know, and also thinking about power in art, and who gets to make art, and who gets to really have the resources at hand to really like live a full creative life, which is very difficult. You know, it's even writing is maybe one of the like most material kind of cheap things to do, because you just need a notebook and a pen, but it's very time intensive. And so it's really hard to do writing if you like have a full-time job, if you have like all these other kind of responsibilities. And also thinking with dancing and like painting, like I know a lot of different artists who work in different modalities, and we're all kind of struggling with this question of like, how do we feed our bodies and take care of ourselves and make art at the same time, and like how that is related to money, and how money and art kind of interplay, if that makes sense. And, you know, on the one hand, I know a lot of people who are like, oh, money is like, you know, like kind of taints things, but it's also sort of how we survive, you know, in the world. And so there's like I wanted to kind of acknowledge that money was like a real factor in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you present this very familiar depiction of what it means to be an artist, what it means to be a writer, especially sometimes comparing some of the characters in the book. And it, yeah, like I said, it was almost too familiar. It made this book feel like I had to step away from it a couple of times just to be like, maybe I should be writing rather than looking for a job. So no, I mean, you absolutely nailed that kind of materialistic element of art as a career. I guess I'm also quite interested in your approach to the power dynamic between Rabbit and the choreographer, considering that there's a huge age difference between the two of them. It was about 20 years, is it, around that? And that he's very wealthy, he's become very wealthy through his career, and she's like a struggling artist. And I mean, there are lots of examples, right, in like the day-to-day now of places where those relationships have been exploitative, and they've been like, you know, you hear about them and they're very uncomfortable. It's not necessarily the ones that make the news, but sometimes you hear about these relationships between I don't know, like big studio execs or whatever, and like younger struggling artists. And how did you, I mean, it's a delicate topic, and I mean, did you get in your head a little bit about this in terms of like not wanting to romanticize that, but like you're writing something that's very different to the kinds of relationships that I'm describing? How did you manage to like distance this relationship from something that would, like, from the first page, people would be like, this is immediately wrong. I'm not behind this because this feels wrong from the get-go. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. I noticed one question in there, which is, did I get in my head about it? Which, like, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I did. And totally. And because, I think there's like a clear difference between like being in a relationship where there's like a power imbalance, which sort of happens a lot, like even if there aren't overt ones, like there's someone who makes more money, there's someone who comes from more money, there's gender imbalance, there's like that I think that's I feel like that's almost nearly universal, that there's some negotiation in a relationship versus like power over, that there are relationships where someone has power over that other person. And then that is a problem where like, where someone's agency is being taken away. And I wanted to make that distinction clear. And I worried about that a lot, and still probably do, even though it's too late. But then with what I wanted to do with this book, and that kind of goes back to the empathy part, was that I just really wanted to get in her brain and her experience, and not to sort of bring my own judgments and assumptions of what this relationship would look like, or bring in the assumptions of the outside world or someone else, and to just let her have her full experience, regardless of what that was, and to just follow it wherever it would take her, and let her kind of like be a full person who's like every experience I was taking really, really seriously. It was quite a wild experience because it's first person, so I felt a little bit like I got taken over by a different brain for a while, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely, it definitely does.
But I think that was sort of the key to the relationship, or trying to depict the relationship as closely as possible, is that I was depicting it through her eyes as closely as possible. Yeah.
That's kind of hard to put down at the end of like your writing day, when you've been in that brain for that long. It's interesting that you say that about, as a writer, not wanting to be judgmental, because as readers, I feel like we're almost expected to make a judgment on the characters that we read about. And like, in contrast to Carmen's quote about your book, there was another one that described it as frightening, and I thought that was really interesting. I mean, there's lots of other adjectives, right? There have been horny, incredibly hot, like erotic, like frightening is one of the many adjectives, but I thought that was quite interesting. Where, if anywhere, do you feel that like that sense of fear or like forebodingness is coming from in this story?
Well, I think I also am interested in that frightening. I like it kind of. Because I don't think it's like necessarily what's happening in the plot of the book that is frightening, but the experience of being so close to another consciousness who is maybe doing things that you wouldn't do, but you have to take very seriously their experience. And I'm trying my best not to give you room to judge them and to like carry you through this narrative. I think that is probably what is, I'm guessing. I'm not in the head of
an unfair question, like I'm asking you to understand what someone has said about your book. I thought that was really interesting, because at the beginning of it, I did have this feeling of like, oh God, where is this going to go? This is not a spoiler because it's at the start, but the choreographer suggesting like the amount of time that they're spending together, and movement from one city to another, and that kind of thing, and this is actually maybe a good argument for not reading the quotes of a book before you read the book, because I was like, oh God, what's going to happen? And it's not a horror story, it's not a thriller for anybody who's worried about that. But I was just intrigued by that. I guess for me, if anything is frightening, it's the it's how real that dynamic between Rabbit and Annie, the best friend, is, and how quick those judgments happen. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about, their dynamic and where the tension between those characters comes through, because I thought that was a really interesting thing that you were exploring in the book.
Right. Yeah. So, as we were talking, so I'm not interested in judging my characters ever. I try to keep, I've actually have been working on new stuff, and I've noticed my own judgments coming in, and that's something I'm always sort of trying to kind of reel back. And as I was working on it, though, but the thing is that, she is going to have to contend with the outside world at some point, with the perception of it. And I knew that was going to happen. And I was almost avoiding it for when I was doing my early drafts. In my early drafts, she almost had no life. Annie didn't exist. And my friend was just sort of why doesn't she have any friends? Someone I gave it as a beta reader was what's going on? What's at stake? What is she potentially going to lose by being in this relationship? And then I realized what she's going to potentially lose is and then Annie sort of came out of that, this character who's, she's known since she was 18 years old. And the dynamic between them is kind of born out of many different sort of friendships that I've had, as a young woman, and how you're kind of trying to discover yourself and you're trying to figure out who you are. And part of that is a conversation with yourself, but it's also in conversation with other people. I found myself sort of identifying with and against a lot of my friends, especially the ones that I met when I was at that very tender, young age. And I realized that this relationship could be going against all her preconceptions of who she was, and that would be really challenging, and that could be kind of formed through this friend who is someone that she has been really intimately attached with for a very long time. And I think of this book as being kind of a three-hander. I think the friendship between the narrator and Annie is just as important and major as the romantic relationship in this book. I think really it's it's not just a horny novel, it's also a novel about the relationships we have with all these other people in our life, and the power dynamics and how those shift, and what happens when someone kind of seems to change a little bit, whose identity is no longer quite so clear to other people. What does that do to the way you think of yourself, the way you think of your friendship, which I think is a crisis that Annie, the character, is sort of going through when she sees her friend going into this relationship.
I think you're the first writer I've spoken to who has said it's not just a horny novel about their work. It's
Okay.
And it's not. Alyssa is absolutely right. You said something really interesting actually at the start of our chat about that internal and external representation, and Rabbit does this really shows that in the way that she'll be speaking to Annie, or Annie will be speaking at her about questioning her queerness and kind of invalidating her queerness because of this new heterosexual looking relationship, which is quite a heartbreaking thing to when you're reading it, but is very real. And it's interesting because Rabbit herself doesn't seem to be questioning those things outside of those interactions with Annie. When she's with the choreographer, the internal dialogue is the internal monologue rather is more about this lust and thinking about him and touching and all of these other kinds of thoughts that you would have about somebody that you're excited to be sleeping with, and it's only after kind of speaking with Annie that we get these vignettes of thinking back on what Annie is saying about questioning her sexuality. So I thought that was a really interesting way to approach just sexuality in society in general, in that when we're alone as people or with our partners, we're not sitting next to our partner thinking, oh, this is a lovely gay relationship, or this is a lovely straight relationship generally. I mean, maybe you are. Tell me if I'm wrong in the comments, in the Q&A, or just walking down the street. unless something external happens to us, and like questions that or makes that real. And yeah, I've just like fascinated to hear you talk a bit about that, that kind of like the external, what makes sexuality, what makes us like label certain things and think about things in certain ways because of other people versus the person that is in this character's head, like the actual about Rabbit themselves.
Well, I mean, like, you know, we want community, and we want to feel recognized, as many parts of ourselves be like recognized by each other as, you know, possible. And that's really important. That's really important to the narrator too, I think. And that's why that kind of not getting things recognized by Annie is so devastating or so painful to her, or why it's so difficult to her. Because, like, you know, you are right that, like, you know, when you're with your partner in bed, you're not really thinking about like, what does this say about my community, I think, a lot of the time, or at least maybe I'm not, I don't know. But then you do still need that community. Like you still need that recognition from the outside world. And it can be very painful to like have it removed, or to feel like you no longer fit, or to feel like you can no longer be part of it. And that's sort of what I wanted to convey. I have no answer at all for it. I just wrote this book, and that was like my response to those feelings.
It's okay. I don't think we can expect the writer to write the book and have all of life's answers. That feels unfair. I do have more questions actually coming from our lovely audience. And yeah, please keep them coming because these are wonderful. This is from Layla. Hi, watching from Fife and loving this chat so much. I'm interested in what you're saying about not applying your own morality to the characters, Alyssa. How do you navigate the taboos in this kink space and in these power dynamics? Was there anything you felt that you couldn't put in the book?
Is there anything I felt like I couldn't put? I don't remember. I don't think there was anything that I was like, I can't put this in there. But I think I was very careful to kind of show the ways that she has agency and control. Like I was very careful to make it a fully consensual relationship, and to have her be the person who was like the active sort of pursuer. I didn't want it to be something that was like coming on high. Like I wasn't interested in writing like a book about like a naive young, like very young person getting like damaged. This is more about, she's a fully grown adult, you know, she's in her 30s, someone who's kind of discovering new things about herself, and then kind of trying to integrate that into what she knows about herself. So that was sort of what I was thinking about as I was working on it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. Thank you, Layla, for that question. And Kyle, did you have the entanglement of these relationships, these evolutions of characters in mind from the start? Or did the characters evolve as the book made its way onto the page?
It did evolve. Like I knew I knew kind of the general direction of their relationship. And I also knew the final scene. And that's a little bit kind of how I actually, so far, knock on wood, I mean, things change, but usually I'll have like an opening scene and an ending scene. And I'll be trying to get from one place to the next. So I had the ending scene in mind, but I didn't quite understand what it meant. Like I didn't really know if it was like a good thing or a bad thing, or like what were the sort of feelings about it, until I went through and started writing. And then as I was writing, I kind of felt like I was getting to know the characters. And then once I started to understand them, then I kind of understood all the kind of intricacies of their relationship, which I think if I had like brought my kind of judgments in as being like, I'm going to write a novel that's about like X, I don't think I would have kind of given myself the space to like figure that out. So it was like kind of like a rare but difficult balance that I went through to sort of get there.
I guess I'm really interested in that thing, that idea of like withholding your own judgments from the characters, because you're not saying that you're not like having these judgments. Like it's natural to like think about the kinds of people that you're writing about and consider what they're doing, and as you're creating them. But it's like this deliberate thing that you're saying about not writing about them judgmentally. Was that because of something that you didn't want the readers to experience, or you yourself didn't feel like interested in writing like that? Like what is that intention behind not judging?
I think it's both. I feel like I wanted the reader to kind of have the same experience of empathy as I was having, with the characters, where you're getting as close to another consciousness as possible and kind of seeing the world through their eyes, as opposed to, if you're judging, you're bringing in your own consciousness, and you're kind of, at least this is how I view judgment, which is that you're coming in with your own idea of someone and then just sort of squishing them onto it, and when I, as a writer and like a person, when I find myself doing that, I find it personally to be like an unpleasant experience for myself, to feel myself sort of doing that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's fun, I guess, if you're gossiping about someone's like shitty partner or whatever.
I did judge Ian.
Right, exactly. But that is not what I feel that I am trying to do when I'm trying to write, or when I'm trying to make art. I'm not trying to take a mold and squish it onto other people. I'm trying to do something different. It's kind of like a sort of intimate exploration that can kind of really only happen when I take a step back, if that makes sense, from who I sort of am in my walking around everyday life, where I'm being this bread sucks. This store is terrible.
Yeah, empathy then is the perfect word, right? Because you're thinking about what you would not want other people to think of you as as a set of rules or a set of characteristics. And so why should you apply that to the characters that you're writing about? And writing about characters is writing about people. And that just does make sense. It's just kind of a refreshing thing to hear, I think. We have another audience question from Jay. Your, or Rabbit's, exploration of queerness resonated so profoundly with me. You negotiated bi and self-erasure brilliantly, and that is so rare. I'm curious what other literary bisexuals you have enjoyed reading, or who you've drawn inspiration from.
Oh no, I know I have so many, but as soon as that question got asked, my brain just imploded. Melissa Febos, fantastic. I think who's not a fiction writer, but a nonfiction writer. But she's fabulous. A wonderful writer about sex and desire and bodies and what all that sort of means in the world. I'm going to keep thinking.
Yeah, that's quite right. Sit with the question. Yeah. Thank you, Jay. As more audience questions come in, I want to ask you a bit about the thing that you've got in this book of the Boston-New York rivalry, which is such a thing. I lived in Boston for a year, and it's really strange. They're so close, but they're also not that close in the span of the UK. What is close in the UK? But there's such different cities. But you're from Philadelphia, is that right? Or you live in Philadelphia, but you spent a lot of time in Boston. Talk to us about that rivalry, or that difference between these two cities, and why it's such a thing of when are you going to leave Boston and live in a real city like New York?
Yeah, especially, so I'm actually from the Midwest. So I'm from Iowa, which is, if you were to throw a dart at the middle of the United States, you might hit it. It's pretty far from the East Coast. But I spent my whole adult life on the East Coast, and have lived. I lived in Boston for 4 years. I've lived in Philly for a while, and I think of the different cities in this book as being characters in their own right. Like they all have different personalities. And like a thing that I also wanted to write about was just sort of the way your environment or just place kind of affects you, like affects the way you function, affects the way you think about yourself, which like I felt very drastically when I moved from Philly to Boston, which is like almost as far from as you can get from each other on the East Coast. So they're very different cities. I just like kind of felt like a different like person in Boston. Like I the last time I was in Boston, there just 4 different people just out of nowhere would start talking about how cerebral the city is and like use that word cerebral. And I'm just like, what is with this city and thinking of itself as being like cerebral and like talking about it all the time?
And is it?
Yeah, well, it's just because there's so many universities there. There's just
Sure.
like this big pressure, I think, or something. I don't know, but it is this like feeling of like we're gonna really function now. Whereas if like Philadelphia is like a different city, it's like much more kind of a vibrant, chaotic place. Sorry, I just insulted Boston, I think. It's all right. And
Boston
the
is just about studying.
And like the Boston, New York rivalry is extremely sort of real, especially I sort of experienced it more kind of in the like writing zone. Like I remember there'd be like conversations of like, oh, Boston is where you write and New York is for publishing, because like American publishing kind of lives in New York City. And so it's like there is a sort of rivalry of like New York City is like the real place, and Boston is where people talk about being cerebral all the time for some reason.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, because there is that like that history in that sense that like New York is like where the American literary scene is based, and America is such a big country that can't be the only place that you can live if you anyway, this is probably just like a question based off my hang-ups of living in Boston and constantly feeling like I needed to go to New York. We have more in-depth questions from the audience from Sal. I just wanted to say yay to seeing another Asian American woman writer doing hot books. Hot is in capital letters. Queer books. More of this, please. All of these were followed by exclamation marks. Also, if I have to ask a question, yes, you do, Sal. Thank you for following this with a question. I wonder if you were ever nervous putting a book like this out into the world and how it has been received. And just before you answer that, Alyssa, I will remark that in your acknowledgements, there are certain people who you've listed as not being allowed to read this book. Maybe that's related.
Oh yeah, my parents and various other family members. My partner's uncle did read it and was like, I wasn't in the list of people who wasn't allowed. I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, well, I will say that like part of my process of drafting the book under lockdown was that I just kind of thought books weren't going to exist anymore, and that publishing wasn't going to exist. That was like a particular time where it was like the terms of the world were really changing. And so I just was like, oh, well, if the world is over, then I'll just really just write what I want to write, which was actually very freeing and very good, because I think I was like very, and I kind of make fun of myself a little bit with the character, but like I was very much like, I have to write about serious things, I have to write about capitalism, I have to like, I have to be like a difficult experimental novelist or something, and being like, oh, maybe the world is ending, I guess I'll just write something that I want to write instead, and that really opened it up. When it came time to publish it and to put it out in the world, I think I just like lived in a great state of denial that was happening, and perhaps still I'm in that state of denial, to be 100% honest, which I think is maybe a healthy way to be a writer, because I think especially with the internet, it's just like way too easy to get too much input about again, about that public self, about like how you're being kind of perceived as an author, which it's different than being a writer and can be a little bit paralyzing if you like let it in too much. And so I've been just like, I'm just like a little bit careful about what I intake, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally does. I mean, especially like maybe that pressure of needing to be visible or verbal online to like sell a thing versus actually like the impact that would have on your writing for starters, and then also on your mental health. is, yeah, I think it's something that a lot of writers are probably trying to balance and they're finding really difficult. Go ahead.
Oh, just one thing that just reminded me one thing. So I moderated an event with Carmen Maria Machado, and she did say one thing that was really helpful that I feel like I should blast out, which is that, like, I mean, you're not going to be understood by like every person, basically. It's not like really possible. And so, like, kind of learning to make peace with that, and also being protective and protecting yourself. And like, I mean, I was like, the people who are listening to my acknowledgements is not being allowed to read the book. Like, they can ignore me and like read the book if they want, but like, I'm not going to be here to like talk to them about it. You know, like that signal is mostly just like, there are just some people like, I don't want you to talk. Like, we just can't have this we just can't introduce this into our interpersonal relationship.
Is that because it would just be too awkward, or is there like some other reason why you just wouldn't, like, it's just not what you would talk about with family anyway, like kink and sex and...
Yeah, I think too awkward. And I think the thought that I might have to one day have that conversation, I think would have made it hard for me to write the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you start to self-censor because you're like, what are my parents going to say about this? Yeah, that does not sound conducive to an enjoyable creative experience. We have a question from Joe, who is asking, do you have any plans at the moment for future books? Have you got any other themes that you would like to write about?
Yeah, I'm still working on stuff, and I'm thinking about other books. I'm scared to jinx myself by talking too much about them. But like, you know, I'm still really interested in this question of like how our different relationships affect our sort of place in the world, and like how that influences us. And so that's like kind of, and there's also a question of like ambition and perception, and like how that shapes who we are in our journeys, and like also how maybe your goal and like the person you think you are, the person you think you want to be, maybe turns out to not be like right, or like you get there and it's different than you experience. And so those are kinds of things that I'm looking at and what I'm working on now. And you know, also the physicality in the body is something that's like I really want to focus. It's like kind of my driving passion, just acknowledging, you know, we have bodies and they're in the world, and it affects how we move through the world. That's something that I'm always incorporating into what I'm writing.
Yeah, totally. I'm just thinking about what you were saying with judgment, or writing about what you want to write. And so Rabbit in the story, for those of you who haven't read it yet, is a writer, and one part in the book she is writing a short story that involves characters that we see, kind of trying not to like give too much away, and that made me think about like choices of your characters and the people that you're writing about. And I'm wondering how different do you think maybe the reception from friends like Annie, or maybe like your own exploration of this narrative would have been if the choreographer was a woman, like an older woman rather than an older man? Like, was it the woman and the man like dynamic that you were interested in exploring because of that like that taboo in like the queer world and like the lesbian world of like going back to men like as a bisexual woman? Or was it something different? Was it, yeah, I don't want to like put words in your mouth. But yeah, do you think, I mean, it probably would have been different, but how do you think it would have been different if the choreographer had been a woman?
I mean, I think it would have been totally different. I mean, I think that, you know, the bi-erasure, the feeling of like, I am one way, but I'm being read a different way by the world, was like kind of the primary thing I wanted to explore in the book. And kind of like one of the driving forces. And so I think if it had been an older woman, it would have been, you know, it would have felt very different. People would have been reading it differently. Their relationship would have been different. And like that anxiety about like losing something, about like the unseen, about like a core part of your identity suddenly being lost or not being perceptible by other people or by your community. and like possibly the anxiety of losing your place in your community because of that was like, it's kind of the emotional core. So it like had to be a dude.
Yeah, I mean, but I feel like she gets part of that from the age difference as well, in the moments that we see her interacting with like his friends, like people from his past. It's that sense of, yeah, like I couldn't really picture like her entire life merging with his life because of the generational difference. I thought that was like, I know that wasn't like a core thing you say that you were exploring, but like that did really intrigue me. The difference generationally. Was that something that you were, I guess, was that something that you were interested in thinking about? So yeah, age differences, but not through the lens that we usually hear about age differences, which is like the triangle of queer films can only be like, or lesbian films can only be like a historical movie and an age difference, and I cannot remember what the third point is, but it's like the Portrait of a Lady of Fire, like all of those films.
Yeah. Do you mean like, did I want to explore like what's it like to date someone who's sort of not versed in your kind of cultural experience? Or
yeah, I mean, like they're from, you know, the friends and family are completely different places and different cultural experiences, and just all of that like comes from just being 20 years older or 20 years younger than somebody.
Well, I think the hardest thing, well, the thing that I wanted to kind of get across was that like he's in a different place career-wise than she is.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I was thinking about that more than the friends and the pop culture stuff. But of course it kind of comes through because his friends are all also more established. And whereas her friends are like working for a dog food app, or, you know, they're all also kind of struggling and stuff. And so I wanted to like show that, but I also wanted to not bring like assumptions about it. Like, again, like I was kind of saying, because I think also, especially the reason I wanted to work with this relationship that was like an older man and a younger woman was, you know, there's like a gut kind of reaction when you sort of see that depicted in pop culture, when you see it like celebrities, or when you see it with your friends, you have a gut, like there's like a kind of gut culture reaction to it. And I want to like work against that, if that makes sense. But it is also interesting to me, like, how do you merge lives that are different, or do you merge them? Do you need to? Like, maybe not. But like the main thing was like the thinking about being at different stages if they're artistic career, especially because they're in different disciplines, you know. So like having someone, you know, a dancer, like a 50-something-year-old dancer is kind of at the end of their career, whereas a 30-something-year-old writer is at the beginning of their career. So also that was like something I wanted to work on.
Yeah, I mean, also that question of like, should you have to, or do you want to merge them, was super interesting. And I guess that comes mostly from maybe it comes from Rabbit's reluctance to have Annie take that place so closely to her lover. This like obsession that her friend has of like, I need to like this man that you're with. And I haven't really seen a lot of books question that. Like, do you have to like my partner? Like, do you have to know him or them, you know, intimately in order to support this relationship that I have? Yeah, it's a difficult question, I think, especially like now, when just talking about like inequalities in relationships and abuse, and the idea that like if someone isn't talking a lot about like the good in their relationship, or isn't showing you that there's kind of cause for concern. I'm like working through ideas here that aren't very coherent, but basically I just thought this book was very interesting and touched on a lot of really interesting things. But Sylvia has another question. So interesting to hear what you're saying about bodies moving through the world in these meat sacks that we have. I was sorry to hear that your health hasn't been great lately. Hope that's okay to say, but I wondered if illness has affected the way that you write or think about bodies.
I mean, definitely, I'm 1,000% more aware of my body. I think, you know, I've been recovering from something. I mean, Yeah, I think if you're lucky enough to like have spent a lot of time in good health, I think you kind of take it for granted. And then just how much your body affects like your experience and your perception and how you think of yourself and how you think of the world. I think that has like kind of really shaken it up for me. And I'm gonna work on it, I guess. I'll think about it some more.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sylvia. And then from Elena, we've got, do you do or do you enjoy writing in other genres?
I'm thinking about it because like I feel like I'm always sort of playing with genre, which I think is very annoying to genre writers. I know they hate it when literary writers say that they do that. Maybe because maybe my answer, or I'm still figuring it out. I mean, I think I find myself not generally thinking too much about genre as I'm writing. Until it's sort of genre kind of becomes a way I feel like that like people in the publishing industry figure out how to talk to each other about books. It's almost like sort of, at least that's how I think of it personally, but I'm sure other people disagree. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and like healthy way to approach writing, right? Because you're not necessarily, not that genre writing is limiting creatively, but to start with that like blank space of this could be anything, and then sort of, yeah, I really like that approach. And you can tell that in a book as well when that approach has been taken. We do have maybe time for a couple more questions, so if the audience would like to keep them coming, please do. But I did have one last question, Alyssa, from me, which was, I guess, about like the craft and like the writing of this. The names of Rabbit and the choreographer, had you decided on what those were going to be when you started writing? Did you have those names in your head, or were they completely nameless to you when you were writing at least like the majority of this book?
That's a really good question. I feel really embarrassed to say I almost don't really remember when I figured out what their names were. I think I knew them fairly early on, and like I hint at them a little bit, but like they weren't nameless to me. I don't think that's what it was when I was going through. I don't exactly remember the moment I figured out their names, though.
No, that's just interesting. Like I feel like that's, yeah, a name really, I don't know, affects how you're writing about a character. And
totally.
Yeah, I was just purely curious on a personal level if you had those in your head as you were going. This may be our last question of the night because we've only got a minute left. From Sal, who is asking, how was it getting this book published? Has it been different in the US versus the UK?
I mean, yes, I think it definitely is different. I'm still kind of getting to know the UK publishing system. It's like very different. It seems to happen really fast over here, or like the process seems to go very quickly.
Oh, really?
More quickly than I was expecting. I just remember one day just being like, oh, galleys are out. When did that happen? Oh my God. But it's been really great. I've had wonderful teams on both sides, and I feel really lucky to be at places where I think the book is like understood and recognized, and like where people kind of get what I was sort of trying to do. Because I know it's like a difficult kind of funny, it's not a very clear thing. It's like a little bit funny. And so I've been really just like really lucky to have found the right homes in both places.
Well, we feel very lucky to have provided a home for this book. I mean, it's so frustrating when a novel is published in the US and doesn't reach its way over here. So I just want to say, I'm looking for my copy. I should have held this up at the beginning, really. It's also a very capturing cover. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on this call. Yeah. And thank you so much to you, Alyssa, for a really fascinating and eye-opening chat about a book that will stay with me for a long time. Also want to say a big thanks to the Lighthouse, and if you haven't already, you can click the link somewhere below this video and buy the book from the Lighthouse. This has been a really wonderful chat. And yeah, thanks again, Alyssa. And I hope everybody has a lovely